problem of evil. So, an objection that some folks have to God is evil in the world. How could an all good God allow for there to be evil, such as a child starving to death, or the abuse of a child? For if there was a person that had power to stop a crime and didn't stop the crime, some would consider that a crime. And oftentimes in the law, and I'm no attorney, that is considered a crime. So if God did exist and was able to stop a crime but didn't, would that not make him evil? So, I guess the challenge we have here is I think we've proved that God does exist and that he is good. So the question would really be, how can an all good God allow evil? Not God doesn't exist because there's evil in the world. I mean, as I even think through it, if there is no God, how can there be evil or good? Wouldn't it just be? I'm not even sure how you could have a universe without a God, but assuming that you could have a universe without God, how could you have good and evil? It seems that, for definition's sake, that good is a thing that exists, and evil is a thing that really doesn't exist, that it is the lack of goodness. Kind of like cold is the lack of heat. A vacuum is the lack of air. Evil is the lack of goodness. So goodness must truly exist, and then evil must be a deprivation of goodness. An evil person still has some good to them. If nothing else, existence is good and they exist, therefore that's good. Even if their behavior isn't always good, but even with some of the most evil people that we could think of, there's still some good in them. And even with ourselves, I think we can find some evil there. So as I think through my own life and evil, maybe one thing that's considered evil is pain. But it seems like that's actually, in my experience, it's actually become the opposite. Pain and suffering are actually the source of the greatest good, which seems like a paradox. How can pain and suffering be good? And for me, the reason that they're good is because there's an identification that happens with Christ when there's pain and suffering. He said, whatever you do unto the least of my brothers, you do unto me. Whether that's visiting the imprisoned, feeding the hungry or the thirst, giving drink to the thirsty, or clothing the naked. And when you do that, you do it for Christ. And when you don't do it, you're not doing it for him. And so if you're hungry, if you're naked, if you're in prison, if you're the least person, then that is a close identification with Christ. And so in my experience, when I'm suffering the loss of a daughter or a father or family or business transactions, whatever might be a difficulty, it's like that attracts Christ instantaneously and powerfully. It's in the times where everything's going right and you have success, and it seems like that's where it's easy to get lost and lose our way, is when those things aren't present. So it seems to me that pain is good. Now, you can have those things happen and rebel against it, lose your patience, get angry. That's true. That's a problem. But that's not a necessary outcome from the pain and suffering. That's a personal choice. That's a rejection, not an acceptance. If you can accept that pain and suffering and difficulty and find joy in it as the saints did, that seems like a sure and true path. Like if you had a blank slate and you said to yourself, okay, I'm going to choose to be happy when everything's going my way and I'm perfectly comfortable, or I get to be happy even when everything's not going my way. And in fact, my joy will increase, as does uh, my pain and suffering and the things that go against my will. I'll become more joyful. So if you could become more joyful as everything goes your way, or you could become more joyful as things don't go your way, which would be a better path to have? It's just as a thought experiment. It seems to me that when things don't go your way and being joyful would be a much surer path, because in this world, we're guaranteed that things are going to go our way. That happens all the time. Whereas, things going our way is rare. So it would seem to be better to be able to be happy when things are not going our way. And then I'm sure we could even find happiness when they do under those circumstances, but we may not even find happiness when things go our way if we can't be happy with things that don't, because we're so busy being resentful about things that haven't gone our way. So it seems that pain and suffering is not the problem, but that our attitude is the problem. And with innocence, that is a more difficult challenge, right? Like if there is a baby that is suffered to torment, how could a good God allow that? Well, we learn, I think, from the Holy Innocents through the Catholic tradition that those innocents that were murdered in the place of Christ, we celebrate them as saints. And yet, they didn't have reason or free will yet, but they had something that could allow for them to be given a great gift, eternal happiness, and to be celebrated as saints for in the liturgy of the Church every year till the end of the world. Now, there is a certain irony, because certain people that argue against God and do it from a place of injustice in the world, and saying because there's not perfect justice in the world, God can't exist, also tend to be for things like abortion. And it seems to me that there's no greater crime than abortion, because it is taking the greatest punishment possible, capital punishment, and applying it to the most innocent, somebody who's not committed any crime against anybody. The only crime is existing. And so, getting off topic slightly, but I think importantly, is how can you be for abortion and yet then decry God can't exist because of evil in the world? And so now you could say, well, the unborn baby's not a baby, but science has completely debunked that. That's pretty straightforward. You can get put in jail for crushing an endangered species eggs because you destroyed the endangered species even though it wasn't yet hatched. And you can even be charged for murder when you assault a pregnant woman and she loses her baby. So, that argument doesn't really make much sense. And then people argue, well, how can you be against abortion for the death penalty? Well, maybe you can, maybe you can't, but those are really not the same thing. One is saying we should punish a guilty person, and the other one is saying we should punish an innocent person. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to say you can punish a guilty person, but not an innocent person. There's no contradiction there. And so you almost have to ask, why would God allow a person who denies his existence before committing perhaps one of the greatest crimes there is, the killing of an innocent person? And that's tough. But, there's a principle that God only allows evil so that a greater good can happen. And it's really for all parties involved. seems to me. So for the baby, maybe the greater good is that that baby is brought into eternal beatitude. And we've seen the case many times where the abortionist or the woman who had an abortion, um, even Roe v. Wade became a pro-life advocate who overcame and used the evil that they had committed to prevent and help others that are struggling with it in the future. And so there is a mystery there on how do all these things work together. But I have seen in my own life that sometimes God will allow me to do bad things so that I am humbled, so I see that I am not the source of all goodness, that I am in need of a Savior, so that I can learn how to come through that and overcome it and become a better person. And so, it's my hope in the world today where there is so much evil, including people denying the existence of their Creator, that that will bring a renewal to society. St. Paul talks about that quite a bit in the New Testament, on how God allows for evil that a great good can take place. And I think we're going to see that great good in this world, but we're guaranteed to see it in the next. In fact, I have a friend who that's his proof of God's existence, evil in the world. That there has to be some type of scale that balances out that evil, and that scale is not balanced in this world, but in the next. And so when you look at the totality of what happens here and in the hereafter, there is a balance, there is a justice, that a Hitler pays for his crimes, that a Stalin pays for his crimes, and that the abortionist pays for their crimes, either here or in the hereafter. So it's interesting that evil can turn from an objection to God's existence to proof that there must be a just God. I hope that was helpful.